All right, we're going to start working with splines. So this tutorial is one in which I'm going to provide you with reference, right? And so you should have access, most likely through Discord, to a zip file that contains both a max file and a reference image. You could see that here. I have copied them down and put them into their own folder. It's important that the max file and the reference are inside the same folder, and that if you were to move them to another location, if you move the max file to another location, move the reference with it. All right. As long as the max file and the reference image are inside the same folder, all right, as long as they sit in the same folder, Max will have no trouble finding it. If at any point the max file cannot find the reference, what you need to do is just open up your material editor, and there will be a node out here saying bitmap, but it will be black, right? Meaning it doesn't know what to display. At which point you'll click in the folder and you'll navigate and find where that is. All right. So, all right. So I'm going to go ahead and start introducing you to the concept of Lathe of splines. So here we are in Max 2022. I'm in the Create panel. You'll see there's a number of little buttons here. Right? In the same way that we can go from create to modify, create is where you create the raw source material. Now we've been working here with these 3D objects, right? The standard primitives. And those have full 3 dimensions to them. I'm going to delete these. So we're in geometry. There's actually additional geometry types here. If we go to the next option, the next button where it's a little circle and a square, that's shapes. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here and I'm going to make some shapes. Now, a couple things that's important to note about working with shapes or splines. It's very important that you primarily work in the front viewport. You can work in the top and the left, right? But the orientation relative to its reference coordinate system is going to have problems. If you remember working with the tree branch and the reference coordinate system, it gets very important for how the various tools that take your spline and turn into geometry work. For them, it's important that you work in the front. It's really not good to work in perspective. If you work in perspective, everything will be created down here on the ground. And I find that in particular working with splines, I like to have reference set up. So I'm going to come in here to line. And when you're working with line, you just click and you can draw lines out there in the world. Right click to end it and hit delete. I can click, and then if I click and hold, I get a curve. Click, and I can go back to doing points. Right click to end it. Another way to create splines, though, is by going through and making a series of objects and combining them together. So that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to make one rectangle that kind of makes this little box at the top, another one that kind of makes the little box at the Lego head's neck, and then I'm going to make one that kind of does the main head shape. I'm going to right click to get out of create, and now I have these 3 different splines. If I go to wireframe, you'll see those shapes. You also see my reference, but because the reference is frozen, you can't click on it. So let's select this main head shape and go over here to modify. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these 3 shapes and I'm going to turn them into a model. Or I'm going to make them into geometry. To do that, I can go in here and either add an Edit Spline modifier, or I could just right click on my model and say Convert to Editable Spline. What I need to do at this point is combine these objects together. So at this point, make sure that you've taken you hover on the edge where it turns into the 2 little arrows going side to side with a line in the middle. And make sure you drag that over so your modifier panel is expanded to 2 windows. It makes it easier to see because this geometry rollout under Edit Spline is very large. So Edit Spline has 3 separate components: vertex, segment, and spline. Spline is the entire spline shape. Segment is the span between 2 points, and then vertex are the individual points. So here under geometry, I'm going to come to attach, and I'm just going to click on the different objects to attach them together. Now, do you see how my cursor changes as I get over a valid object to attach? All right, so now if I click on Editable Spline here and I try to move this, you'll notice the entire object moves. So let's get our reference back in here. My reference is out there in the world. I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to change my X value to 0 on the model because I want to make sure it's centered, right? Because my reference is centered. I'm going to go and turn wireframe override back on because I want to be able to see the spline a little better. All right. So currently, if I go into Spline, I have 3 separate shapes. And if we look at our reference here, zoom in down below, it is one object, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the main spline shape, and I'm going to come over here under Geometry to Boolean. And Boolean is going to allow me to combine those objects together. And there's 3 different types. There's union, subtraction, and intersection. And for us, we're just going to use the default of union. So if I click on Boolean and come over here, you'll notice when I get over a valid object, my cursor changes. See how now that's one object to cut that shape into it, and I combine that shape into it. So I'm going to right-click to turn off Boolean. So now I have this basic shape, but now I want to go in and I want to refine it and then revise it. I want to revise it so that it matches the look of the model. So let's turn off wireframe override. So there's a couple ways you can go in and work with splines. One thing I like to do is if I have something drawn out like this, I like to region select and grab all the points. And you'll notice right away that they have these little handles on them. If I come over here and move it, you'll see that they have these little Bezier corner handles that I can go through and manipulate. Sometimes you need to zoom in close so you can grab them. If the cursor changes and it gets kind of locked into a specific angle, you can use the function keys on your keyboard. F5 will go X. F5 is X, F6 is Y, and F7 is the Z axis. You can see it down here. And F8 will toggle between pairs. But if I want to grab this and move it up, I can't. But if I hit F8 until I get Y and X shown up, then I can move it. So we've given this guy a weird growth on the side of his head. We don't want that. All we're going to do is just region select and then hover over one of the cursors and right click, and that allows us to get into the context menu. And what we want to do is over here between the switch between the different segment types or the different sub-objects is the control to convert the points. And so I want to convert this to a corner. So I'm going to click on that. So now they're all corners. Remember what I do, they just stay these hard corners. Now I want to do some work to adjust them. If I select a point and if I come over here to Geometry, I'm going to click on the spinner for chamfer and drag that and see how it just separates it with a numeric value or by a hard edge. And you can look and see I'm still holding a value of 2. So if I want to grab this and just chamfer it to a value of 2, I can enter it. Now here it's a round. It's a little bit rounder there, so I'm going to select this point. And I'm going to chamfer. And before I do it, I should probably make it line up. I'm going to kind of lower it down so it centers with my reference. Same with these guys here. Any other adjustments? Looks like maybe this should come down a little bit to here and move this over. There we go. All right. All right, we'll come back up. We've got this point selected. I'm at chamfer. I'm going to actually go up to fillet, which is next to it, and click and drag and see how it works similar to chamfer. I released it. It works similar to chamfer in that it separates 2 points, but instead of a hard edge, it's a round edge. So let's do that again. I'm going to do fillet. I think that value is good. It looks like a value of 14. So let's grab this point and enter a value of 14 there. Oops. There we go. It comes almost to that point, which is fine. All right, this is looking pretty good. What I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to adjust this model a little bit more. I don't need these shapes on the side, so I'm going to select them and delete them. There we go. And now I'm just going to go into vertex and select the point here and put that at 0. And select this other point and put that at 0. And I'm actually going to make this point here in the center. I'm going to make him a corner. There we go. All right, so now I have my spline shape. Now, to turn this geometry into geometry, what I'm going to do is come up here to modifier list. And there's going to be different tools in here for doing that. And what I want is actually this thing called Lathe. So if I click on Lathe, what that does is it takes my spline shape and it rotates it around 360 degrees and builds geometry between each one of those sections. Now it's doing it based off of this axis point. The axis is the origin of the world, origin in the world, right? And so when I made sure that the origin of the world was at 0 and I moved the points to 0, now it's doing a really good job. You will notice at the top, let's turn on edged faces here. You can see there's this weird black shape because it's not shading well. We're going to want to turn on weld core, and then it's going to weld those points together. And let's orbit around to the bottom, and the bottom's looking good. If, for example, let's take this spline here, or this shape, and move it over a little bit. You can go to the lathe. It could, if you wanted, you could have it be open like this. Let's come over here to display, and I'm going to turn on backface cull under display properties. There we go. And now we come back, weld core, and orbit around. So it'll depend on the model, the project that you're working on, whether or not you want it to be open or not. So we can go back to this vertex point. Maybe I'll just put that back, or I'm just going to delete it and leave it be open. There we go. Now, if you wanted your model to be rounder, less faceted on the edges, you could increase that number. I'm actually going to just leave it at 16. When, in the future, when you're working on your own lathe projects, the axis might not be right, because in this case, if I go to wireframe here, there's the axis. It's represented by this yellow line, which I'm going to select it and move it. And you can see my model is changing based on that. You can see if I move it up above, see how the lines, they're not all neat, nice and neat coming into this point. They're getting all skewed. And now it's really turning inside out on itself. So you could manually adjust it if you want it to be bigger. That's certainly fine. You could also change the direction it's working off of. X, Y, Z. There's also min, max, and center, which that's relative to the overall bounding box of the model you have. So we'll put this back to Y, see if I do min. If I center it, that's centered on the spline shape itself. Max is it's going to the outer edge. There we go. But pretty much because of the way I built it, knowing how the tool works, it worked out for me. Just be aware that sometimes you'll have to change some of these. If your model, I'm going to go back to display and turn off backface cull. If your model is coming in dark like this, turn off wireframe, and you orbit around, and you can see inside, just double check to see if backface cull is on. Because it's always a good idea to do that when you're working with Spline, because it's very easy to have your model be inside out. And if that's the case, you come over here to modify and just either check or uncheck flip normals, and I'll take care of it. So at this point, we have our spline lathe head. All right, very happy with that. If there's more you wanted to do with it beyond that, you could take this, and I would, of course, first save it, and then you can always convert it to an edit poly, and then from there you could do more. Like if I wanted to grab more regions, select these points in the center, it looks like, yeah, it looks like they're okay. But if you're having any issues with there being a little hole or something, you could region select that area and hit weld and weld them together and try doing that. Or if you decide on the bottom you want that capped off, you could cap it. Or if you want to make it like a real Lego head, you could put a shell on it and reduce the outer amount, but increase the inner amount. There we go. And so now we got us a nice little Lego head. If you wanted, you could build it to scale, round it out more, and you could 3D print it. So that's that. That's starting to work with splines using our very first tool, the lathe.